Hello, good warm welcome to all of you. It's Anna Schmidt here and Andras Baneth with you.
Hi, good evening to everyone.
And we will keep, hopefully for you, a very informative EPSO Assessment Centre Q&A live session.
So with that, this is a great pleasure to welcome you on this webinar. The way we're going to run this is we're going to present to you a couple of overview introductory slides just to make sure that everyone is on the same page and you are all aware of the different steps of the assessment center. But even throughout those slides, and especially afterwards, you're more than welcome to ask questions. And those of you listening to the live edition right now have the privilege to ask any question you like in relation to the assessment center.
We really strongly encourage you to do ask questions, because we think that, of course, we can adapt to your needs as much as possible today during this webinar.
And that's exactly the purpose, to meet your needs. And there is no silly question. There is no question too small to ask, or if you want to ask something, a more global bird's eye view, that's also fine. So feel free to ask us any questions, and we'll try to sort through the questions with the help of our very able and competent team in Budapest, with Lenke, and perhaps Veronica is also here with us.
Indeed.
In terms of technical side, so you see the slide about the sound check. What you can do in most cases, you can restart the browser if the sound doesn't work, or use another browser, and that should fix problems in almost all cases. But the ladies in Budapest are happy to help you bilaterally via email or through the chat. So that's me, and that's Anna.
So warm welcome again. Today's agenda. So we will briefly talk about the EPSO Assessment Centre as such, but afterwards we will mainly cover those exams that are relevant for the AD5 generalist competition. So we will briefly talk about the case study, then the general competency-based interview, the motivational interview, which is, of course, is a very particular type of interview only for those who are taking the generalist exam, the group exercise, the oral presentation, which again is something that is only for the 85 people. And then we will briefly mention what we think is the best way to prepare for the exam itself, for the assessment center itself.
So here's the first question before anything else: whether you've ever taken part in an EPSO or non-EPSO assessment center. So we'll ask our team in Budapest to put the poll, and we invite you to click one of the answers just for us to have a better idea of those present at the live webinar. What is your relation to assessment centers in general? So click one of the three options, and we'll wait a second or two. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, let's assume everyone has voted, whoever wanted to vote. So let's see the results. Thanks for your participation. And scrolling down, most of you have never done an assessment center.
Some of you have done a different one, which, of course, assessment centers are widely used outside of the EU bubble as well. So this is very well possible. And some of you are experienced in the EPSO setting, which is great. So we are always happy to hear as well some ideas from those of you who have already experienced the assessment center.
And just to back up what Anna said, absolutely. So if you have ideas to share and ideas to tell others in the chat box, then please do. We certainly understand that many of you are direct competitors, and that may limit the information you might be willing to share. That's perfectly okay. But if there is something that you've experienced or you think could be interesting or helpful information for the others, please put that into the chat box. We'll try to flag it or read it out so everyone can benefit. So with that, I pass the floor to Anna to say a few words of introduction about the assessment center, which is absolutely not a stressful experience, is it, Anna?
Absolutely not. I think we both went through it, and this is a picture which is probably must be a joke. There shouldn't be any truth about it, I guess.
No, there is no truth. Cartoons are never about the truth. That's right.
So yeah, it's pretty normal to be stressed about your assessment center. So just to reassure you that this is absolutely normal. And if at the end you have some questions how to manage that aspect of the assessment center, we are very happy to give you some tips on that as well, because of course to be in a good shape on that day, that is something very important, and to be in a good shape in the preparation phase as well, that's something relevant as well to many of you actually. So we are happy to tackle those questions as well.
Let me quickly jump in, because I see Carolina asking whether there's a difference between AD, so Administrators Assessment Center, and the one for AST, so Assistants, and SC, which is Secretaries.
So there's, to some extent, quite some difference. And what I would emphasize more is that there's a strong difference between generalist competition and specialist competitions. While in specialist competitions, you would have an interview in the field of the competition itself. In generalist competition, you don't have that, but you have instead, for instance, in the case of the AD5, a motivational interview. So there are, to some extent, different examination during the day of the assessment center. Also, what could happen in the case of specialist competition, sometimes the MCQ, so the variable, numerical, and abstract tests are done on the day of the assessment center. So there are some particularities, but these are always in the notice of the competition. So what I would advise you as a very, very first step is always rely on the notice of the competition, because it includes all the relevant information with regards to the particular test that you would need to take on the day. So let's first of all talk about the role of the behavior competencies. So there are 7+1 competencies that are tested by the EU Assessment Centre. What is important that leadership, and I'm just replying to the earlier question, is only checked for the AD ones, but the rest, so analyzing and problem solving, communication, delivering quality and result, prioritizing and organizing, learning and development, resilience, working with others, are tested for any group, whether it's an assistant level, SC level, whether it's an AD level competition. So basically, the idea behind these competencies is that no matter what position you apply in the EU institutions, these general competencies are needed in order to do those profiles, those jobs well. So when, for the EU institutions, a so-called competency framework was established, these were identified as the crucial, if I can say, soft skills or generic competencies that are needed in order to do your job well in any kind of profile. And these are always tested in different tests. So we included here a matrix which is actually applicable for the AD5 one, the running AD5 competition. And as you can see, every competency is checked by 2 examinations. So if we take the example of analyzing and problem solving, this will be checked in the oral presentation, and it was already checked with the tray exercise, which is something that you have passed already. But all of them are basically checked by 2 tests, and the only one which is a bit, let's say, out of this concept is the motivational interview, which is a test by itself, which is not checking general competencies, but as it says, it checks your motivation. And that's something which is only assessed at the interview, the motivational interview. What you should know as well, that these competencies are, let's say, checked during these different exercises with indicators. So the assessors will assess your behavior through what you show during those exercises. And these could be positive aspects and negative aspects. Positive indicators and negative indicators will be evaluated during the examination. So just to pick the example of working with others, For instance, this is something that usually is seen or assessed during the group exercise. So if, for instance, you are including the others in your decision making in the group exercise, so you are a colleague who is collaborative, who is asking others' opinion, so also relying, instead of always proposing his or her own ideas, you are really including the rest of the team in your decision making, then you definitely show this positive indicator in working with others, and you will get high marks and high points for working with others in the group exercise.
Here's a question from Konstantinos, who's asking whether this is an official assessment grid. It is not. So the official assessment grid is confidential. So obviously we don't have access to that from EPSO. But this is something that we reconstructed with our occupational psychologist expert, who understood very well what EPSO is looking for, and then created this grid for us based on his professional knowledge of assessment centers. So even if this is not EPSO's, it's probably very close to the real thing, because this is how they would evaluate your behavior. And just to back up what Anna was saying, this is about observable behavior. And this is an extremely important part where you need to demonstrate visibly in an observable manner these behaviors. If you consider yourself a great team player, but you keep quiet for 30 minutes in the group exercise, well, you can be the best team player in the world. If they cannot observe you during those tests, well, then you are going to get a very low score. So it's really that sample, that time that you spend in the assessment center that they take, and they extrapolate your behavior on that basis.
As Andras said very, very well, so it really needs to be demonstrated. So sometimes I get the feedback from clients who already went for an assessment center that they are very surprised when they get their competency passport, because they think, for instance, that they are very strong on leadership. However, they got an average point. It only means that on that day, through the different exercises, you didn't manage to show it very well. So simply, what you need to always make sure is to demonstrate those competencies, as Andras said. So you can always think over, for instance, for the group exercise as well, is how to show it actually, how to show resilience, how to show leadership, how to show good working with others, and then making sure that you actually do demonstrate those things during the exercise itself. So this is just a picture of the competency passport or overview that you would get. So when you have taken the assessment center, and once you are informed of the result, you will get this picture and also the points that you receive for the different competencies. It is always between 1 to 10. Or 0 to 10 actually, and you pass if you reach the pass mark of 3. And what I can say that usually it's pretty easy to reach a pass mark. It's more about the competition than on. So not to be in the average, but to score high. That's basically the biggest challenge, I would say. And I would already say that usually EPSO doesn't. I mean, in the competitions, it's very rare you would get 10 points or 9. So it really means that you are absolutely outstanding. People, I mean, in EPSO, usually they give points which are somewhere above 3, but maybe I would say lower than 9. So that's somewhere the range.
The 5 to 7 range tends to be the typical.
Yeah. So let's talk about the case study. It is part of the assessment center, even though it is usually, or not usually, it is always on a different date. It is a written simulation exercise where you get an assignment, so a task to work on, usually with some sub-questions. And you have to answer those questions in a kind of an essay format. And respond to those and have a good final document before the deadline or before the time under strong time pressure. What strong time pressure means, and I saw already, I think, Giovanni's question that this year is 60 minutes, how to manage under 60 minutes to write a nice coherent text under this or based on this realistic scenario that you get. Indeed, it's a challenge. We can give you some tips on what we think works very often well. But definitely the biggest challenge is the time. So this is really something that usually in 5 hours, you could all deliver something pretty good and substantial. But the thing is that under time pressure, under 60 minutes, this is really a challenge for all of us. As I explained, usually this is an assignment, which is a very realistic scenario. For instance, that you are working in one of the commission services in one of the DGs, and you have to, for instance, prepare a note to your head of unit or to your director who is going on a mission, and you have to brief him on different, let's say, aspects of one topic. For example, he's going on to one of the member states, and you need to brief him on an unemployment related topic, and maybe you need to list some pros and cons for a possible new legislation. Maybe you have to cover some general overview of the existing legislation, and maybe provide him some recommendations. These are very typical topics. So listing pros and cons, recommendations, giving an overview, for instance. These are very common questions that are asked from you in your assignment. And what is very important, that you don't work on the basis of your background knowledge, but you have background documentation. So you need to base yourself on background documents that are all on the screen. And you, by reading or at least screening those background documents, you have to prepare a note for instance, for your head of unit, as I said, the scenario. And what they check is different competencies. Usually it could be analyzing and problem solving, it could be communication, it could be delivering quality and results, and it also could be prioritizing and organizing, depending on the competition. In this case, for the 85, there will be 3 of them checked this year. And yeah, basically, the idea usually is to answer these questions in a kind of an essay format. So especially in non-specialist competitions, usually they don't have some kind of very particular formatting like speaking points or something which has a very non-typical format or something that would be more challenging simply because of the format.
Yeah, there was a question about the simulation exercises that you can buy on our website, whether they are 90 minutes. That's what they used to be, but we adapted them and now it's 60 minutes. And then there's another question about here, I think from Juliana. Should we include data object recipients? Would it be a hint to identify who we are?
So, for instance, recipient actually is one of the indicators for communication. So if you address the note to the reader, this is something very good to do. We advise you to do it because, of course, but whenever it's about communication, usually it's very good if you know who is your audience and you adapt the language, the content to that audience. So if it's the general public, you will say something different than if you write to a specialist. So usually it's very good to address it. Of course, you should avoid making it identifiable. But if you put, for instance, recipient or subject, these are very common things to include. Data as well, it's okay. But for instance, I would avoid doing is giving some kind of a fake name to yourself or anything like that. And of course, what is very, very important, never, never, ever use your own name because you are excluded immediately. Okay, audit case study test. I see a question here, whether they also test your knowledge. No. So the audit case study, actually it was done, I think, will it be done? It's tomorrow, isn't it?
Possible.
I think it's tomorrow. So no, it doesn't check the knowledge. It only checks these general competencies. So it's not a knowledge-based test either for the auditors.
Here's another question, Anna, from Claire. Do we have to use specific template depending on the type of document they request? Note to the file or briefing or...
There are some common elements that I would advise you to do. So for instance, in general, if it is a good idea to have an introduction and a conclusion. So I would advise you to do that, except if the assignment is something really particular that would not allow you to prepare an introduction and a conclusion, because maybe you have to give completely independent 3 points. But usually I think it's a very good idea to have a proper introduction and a proper conclusion. And otherwise, usually they don't really test you with the formatting. I could imagine that more, for instance, a communication case study where maybe they would say, okay, let's do briefing points or speaking points, which have a special way of communication. But otherwise, I would just say more that as a general format, I would have a proper title, of course, date, maybe a cover email if you have the time for it. And then otherwise, introduction, conclusion, and usually there are 3 questions, sometimes 4, sometimes 2 that are asked. So of course, those would be the headers in your text.
And Barbara is asking whether an essay format, what does it actually mean? So it's journalistic style or briefing style? I think the answer to this is briefing style. So that's more professional. You don't want to use probably a lot of metaphors or a very informal style. So certainly keep it professional. And in terms of formatting, also using bullet points and using a very clear structure helps you a great deal. So having relatively short paragraphs, segmenting your text into logical building blocks, highlighting, well, you cannot truly highlight, but you can use all caps, or you can use numbering, or you can use just a little dash for formatting. All of this helps the reader understand the logical sequence in which you build up your arguments.
And just another thing to add, or actually 2 things to add. So one of them is that I would advise you to use more like a neutral format. So instead of using a lot of I's or in my opinion and so on, but try to use more a neutral language instead, because usually they don't really expect you to form an argumentative document in most of the cases. And another thing to add is that according to our sources, this year's 85, we used the old text editor, so not the new one, because you might have received different information, because EPSO is actually updating its let's say text editor. But as far as we know, the old one will be used.
What is the difference?
There are a few differences. Basically, the main difference would be that there are more formatting options in the new one. So you would have bold, italics, underline, while in the old system, you don't have it. So it's good to be prepared to use other formattings, as you have just said, like capitalizing, numbering, and so on.
Then I see an early question from Esther about the group exercise, but that's something we'll come back to.
We will come back to it.
Yeah, go in sequence. So yes, this is a little plug for the various webinars and online simulations that you can access through our website. And we're proud to say that this week we are just adding right now a case study in German, Italian, and Spanish, given that these languages are used for the case studies. So you can practice it in those languages if that's the language of your exam, along with the English and French ones that are already available. And you can do just a simulation online, or you can ask one of our evaluators to look into your reply and send you a personalized feedback on what you did right and what you could improve.
I see another question just as the last one for the case study. So can we copy paste from the background documents? So not. The copy paste only works within your own text, but you cannot copy paste from the background documents. Of course, what you can, and also keyboard shortcuts don't work. And in general, what I would say is try to shorten those information which are in the background documents. And of course, you can. I mean, if you want to type a sentence because it sounds perfect, you are free to do that, but I wouldn't exaggerate and do it too often.
Yeah, just to confirm that Claire is asking, it's in line with the new format, so 60 minutes is what we offer. Let's transit to the next element, next component of the assessment center, and that's the CBI, which is the competency-based interview or structured interview.
So the competency-based interview is a particular type of interview because it is always asking for examples. So just to give you a few of those, for instance, for learning and development, could you please tell us about a time when you needed to learn a complex new skill or procedure? And you always have to respond with one example, one real example from your past. Just to pick another one, for resilience, tell us about a time when you had to deal with a very stressful situation at work. Or for leadership, describe a change or achievement where you had to drive a team through or convince them of a change. How did you achieve this?
Can I just point out maybe two things before you come back to this, Anna? One is the leadership competency. Those of you who are not that familiar yet with the EPSO system, important to emphasize that leadership is not management skills. This is not about you managing a team or having any sort of authority over others in any of your previous jobs or your current job. What leadership is really about what you see in this question, that it's about persuasion, it's about showing an example, it's about trying to have others follow your example or your ideas without you having any formal authority over them. So leadership is something that you can easily possess as a trainee, and it's not linked to any formal position you've had. The other point is again, sort of, I'm the voice of the people. I'm even asking questions that you don't even know you want. It's what is your view, Anna? And I know you get this question a lot, on using private or not necessarily purely professional examples as a reply to these questions. For instance, can I use an example how I learned to dive to learning and development? Is that acceptable?
Well, what I would emphasize that I strongly encourage you to use more professional setting for your examples. But if you mix it from time to time for something, for instance, of sport related, or something that you, for instance, if you play in a band and that you want to show leadership, how you coordinated your band for going for some kind of a music festival. So that's okay-ish. It's also sometimes, I think, can be entertaining, especially if you need to give 15 examples from your past, so one or two could come from another setting. But in general, I would completely avoid anything which is private, so anything related to your private life, anything, any private matter. But I would say you can from time to time mix it with a bit different examples, because the main thing is to demonstrate the competencies. And sometimes whatever the setting is, of course, it's better if it's a professional setting, but you can demonstrate leadership with this kind of example as well. So that's not the end of the day, end of the word, especially if you have shorter work experience, which can come, especially in the case of the 85 generalist, which in principle doesn't need any work experience, any prior work experience.
Here's another question. Can the candidates use the same answer for different questions?
So you can use the same setting, like for instance, you refer to a case that you worked on a law firm, and maybe it took several months until you worked on that particular case, and you will refer to that example several times. But of course, you will show it from a different angle. So for example, maybe in learning and development, you will describe how you learn from I don't know, the senior associate in the law firm while working with him on this complex case. Then maybe you will show your resilience because you will use the same setting working on that case, and maybe that you needed to stay long hours in the office working to meet a deadline, or maybe you will use it for leadership because you will describe how you worked in a team and how you coordinated your team with the different associates. So what I would say is that you will always emphasize a different aspect depending on what competency you are responding to, or what is the question exactly tackling. And what I would emphasize is that in general, it's good to bring different examples. So it's also, let's say, a bit more entertaining for the assessors if you bring different examples, but also in general, if you repeatedly use the same example, they might say, okay, could you please say another one?
And here's another question. Do all candidates get the same questions?
Yes, it's the exact same questions. So it's a structured interview, so they really make sure that they compare orange with orange and not orange with a banana, if I can say that.
You can say that. That makes sense. Which makes it relatively easy to prepare for it, right? So in terms of what you can expect, there is no major surprises. And yet many candidates don't score very high if they don't prepare for it properly, because you need to have the examples top of mind. You immediately need to be able to tell that story of an example, and you need to frame it in a way that it corresponds to the competency in question. And all of these things require practice and very deliberate collection of these examples, because otherwise it's very hard to do this on the fly. If you, Anna, ask me right now, tell me about a time when I had to deal with a stressful situation at work, I probably could recall something.
I'm sure you have a couple of those.
Yes, daily. But still, finding the right example, the relevant example that truly demonstrates the points I want to make, that's the difficult part.
And what I think is not only to find the right example, but to emphasize in your actions, and we will come to our next slide, what are demonstrating the competency. That's the biggest key, basically. I think many of you know very well this approach that we will share with you, which is the STAR methodology, which would mean that in example-based questions, you would build up your response according to this STAR method, which means that S stands for situation, T is task, or I also call it sometimes trigger, so something that triggers your action. Then the action or actions are coming, and the result. Well, if I was coaching you right now, I would definitely ask you the question, what do you think is the most important out of the four?
Well, actually, let's ask that question. So type that into the chat box. Which one is the most important from these four in your answer to the situational?
Fantastic. I
questions.
See lots of action and a few results.
Right, action or result.
Okay, action or result. So actions are the most important, because those are the things that, or those are the actions or the activities that will show through which they can examine that you demonstrate those competencies. So it's really so you are not able to demonstrate the competency through the result. It's what I would say, it's more about the how did you deal with a kind of a situation than on the what. So in your actions, this is the kind of the question, the most important question to respond is, how did you tackle that situation? How did you, what kind of things did you do in order to act well in that particular situation? So result is important as well, but what I would say, result becomes a little bit more important in negative questions. So whenever there's for instance, if they ask you about a failure. So of course your actions will be not sufficiently good enough. Somewhere there will be something missing. And where you can turn it positive is actually if you describe what in your results. It's, I would say that if you say, okay, this is what I learned from this experience. So we all have negative experiences. It's important to use them as a learning opportunity. And that's where result can be, to some extent, quite important. But otherwise, your main focus should be really on the actions.
And just to underline this point, that many candidates intuitively would describe the situation in too much detail. So we've seen over the years that candidates would say, well, there was this work that I was in, like this law firm example. So I was working for this law firm, and this was a Fortune 500, or this law firm was working for Fortune 500 huge companies. There was a huge competition law practice, and there were 15 people employed. And then the boss, who was just hired from another law, and I could go on and on and on.
Exactly.
This is pointless, because your role in this situation it's only highlighted at the action part. So make sure that the situation and the task are very brief, and your own input, your personal actions, your personal role in the situation is the most important. And here's a question on a sorry, you wanted to say?
Yeah, one important aspect which I definitely don't want to forget to say, because I saw it also among the comments, so that you have to respond very rapidly. So while I'm always saying that, let's say, competency-based questions are very, very common in other interviews as well, but what is very particular in the EPSO setting, that these questions are coming very, very, very rapidly. So you have something like 90 seconds to respond. It's a rough estimation, but this is really something that needs also particular training, because usually you would spend more time. As Andras says, really the situation you can't describe in length. And will they stop you? Yes, they will really, really, Juliana, I can confirm, they will really stop you if you are too long. They are, by the way, constantly interrupting. So what you should know, that they ask the very, very same question throughout the whole competition from every candidate. But what may vary is the follow-up questions. So for instance, if Andras is describing the law firm situation, so he's lost in the situation. So what I would ask as an evaluator is that, okay, Andras, but what have you done in that situation? What was your task to do? So I would interrupt him. I wouldn't let him to go on and on. And what you should know, that they are very much, let's say, guiding you through the interview with their sometimes annoying interrupting questions. So it's not easy to sometimes follow the logic of the evaluators, but they do use a lot of interruptions. And how you should react if they are interrupting, just go with them. So they are in the driver's seat. What you should know, that it's really them who are the drivers. So you just go whatever they ask the question about, you go with that.
And don't lose your calm, because otherwise your resilience might suffer.
Exactly. So you just go with whatever question they had.
Go with the flow. And then just to highlight, obviously there is far more to say about the competency-based interview, and all the tricks and all the tips, and how to find good stories that you can share with them, all the way to the specific words you could use in your reply to make sure that you optimize and and your scores are as high as they can possibly get. So we recommend you the various webinars and online resources that we have available on the website, with various insights and practices.
And just one thing, because I do see that there are lots of, the question comes back many times. So how many questions to expect per competency? So usually they ask roughly 5 questions per competency, and you will have about 10 minutes per competency. So if, as for instance, this year's 85 competition will have 3 competencies checked during the CBI. So you will have about 30 minutes to spend there. And there's a short introduction at the beginning. So that's roughly the indication. And just to respond to another question, so there's something, so whether the competency is announced, which is tested, so not. I would say that it was the practice in the past, but last year I haven't heard any competitions where they announced which competency they are testing. So the board actually has the freedom of choice whether they announce which competency they test. But the practice these days that they try to make it as hard as possible. And what I would say is that usually they don't announce it anymore. And what is again another practice which I saw in the most recent competition, so there was a research competition and there's an ongoing competition law and financial law, and there are several profiles. But in those CBI, I could also see that they mix up the competencies. So they actually don't follow any kind of order, which was the practice in the past, but they simply just
jump around.
Exactly.
Yeah. Here's a question about the role of introduction. So the competency-based interview starts with the assessor's request towards you, the candidate, to introduce yourself. What is the role and what are some best practices on now before we move on to the motivational interview?
So first of all, it's an icebreaker. So this is something that is not given any points for, but what you should know that before you go into that room, the evaluators don't know anything else of you except of your name, and they get your ID picture. So they have no idea of your background. This is also because they don't want to get biased by reading your application form. So they start the interview without knowing anything of you. And of course, you will bring up plenty of examples. So when you mention the, international law firm that you worked in, then of course it's important that they can connect it to some kind of a little information that they have of you. So this is where the introduction is coming into picture, because they need a rough, idea of your background and your setting. And a very important thing is that, of course, it's also a first opinion. So, and you cannot, estimate how important it is to make a good impression at first. So I would really say that even if it's not scored, you should very well prepare your introduction, because it will, an interview is always to some extent subjective, and it's very important to do well your introduction. And it's also because it's the first moment when you go into that room. I can guarantee that at least to some extent you will be nervous probably. So it's good to well prepare it at home. So it's something that you can, in advance that it will be there. So why not to prepare it?
And make sure that when you do the introduction, you sound as natural as possible, not so rehearsed. It's a bit like the best actors don't sound like actors. So this is very important for the intro. Just a final question, which I think is important to clarify from Jose, is that he says he's confused because he said below that you have 90 seconds per question, but then you say you spend about 10 minutes on each competency. So can you clarify?
Yeah, sure. So basically it's something like 2 minutes per question and answer. But of course they need to ask their questions. So you have about 90 seconds to respond. So 1.5 minutes to respond. Because of course they need to ask their question, they need to ask their follow-up question. And what I would say, as I said, is that you have something like 5 questions per competency. So if it's 2 minutes per question, 5 minutes per or 5 questions per competency, it would add up to 10 minutes per competency. And then it depends. So the length really depends on how many competencies are checked.
So just to give an example, one competency would be, for instance, resilience. And then they can ask a lot of questions around resilience. So they can ask you for a second example or even a third example. And then they can ask details about those examples.
Yeah, exactly. So for instance, they could ask you on resilience about could you please give an example when you needed to go through a major change in your professional life? Then they could ask you, could you please say an example when you had a failure? So they will simply ask several questions and measure how resilient you are through those responses that you give for those questions.
Yeah, and again, I just like this question, so we'll address it quickly before moving on. So for resilience, how do you avoid the trap of giving a too negative example? And I think, let me give my perspective first and then yours, Anna.
Yeah.
The most important there is not so much the example or the situation, but what you made out of it. So it's really your role and then the outcome. So if you failed a driving test or you missed a major deadline at work and then you lost a major project as a result, what is it that you learned? And if you can even add how that learning actually helped you later on, then it really becomes a positive story ultimately and reflects well on you, saying, well, I messed it up back then, but here is how I could use that learning for my benefit.
And what I would add to what Andras has said, so we all have negative examples. So now it's 164 people in this webinar with us. I can guarantee that all the 164 people had failures, had missed opportunities, had some conflicts. So this is part of working life. What is very important is that you learn from them, and if you didn't do something well about them, you say, okay, I wouldn't repeat the same thing again because what I've learned is this or that. So that's where you can turn it actually positive, because we all have it. It's human to have it. It's more than you reflect on it and you let's say grow out of the negative experiences as well. So I think that's where you can turn it positive.
And then a related question is about the interview in the field. What do you have to say about that, Anna?
Well, I mean, in the interview, that's a very particular interview. It's not part of our webinar today, but what's very important there is that also on those examples, so especially if it's a technical example that they ask for, and maybe they ask for a failure in something that you technically messed up, that's okay as well, because it's really how you react as well. So they also want to see, like, especially if they test resilience with these questions, and it's more about saying, like, I didn't take it personally, I kind of reflected, I took responsibility for it, for instance. So it's more like how you behave when you don't do something well is a kind of a question. So for instance, what I always appreciate, if somebody says, like, yes, and I went to my boss and I admitted that I didn't do it well. And that's it. You take the responsibility for it. I went to the client and I admitted that I didn't do it well. And that's it. You take the responsibility. Yep. It's human. You try to work around afterwards, but you take the responsibility.
It's not so much what you did, but how you acted or reacted to it.
Exactly.
Good. Let's move on to the motivational interview, which is a relatively new addition to the EPSO universe and the assessment center. So, Anna, what do you have to share with our participants?
So it's a particular kind of interview which is only for the 85 generalist competitions, and it was introduced in 2018. So the first time people were doing this interview was actually last year, because that's when they reached their assessment center. It's a 20-minute interview, and what is important to know that it has a relatively lower importance, because it's only 10 points out of the maximum of 90 points that you can get for the assessment center. You have limited number of questions. Well, I can tell you that last year it was something like 16 questions in 20 minutes. So what is definitely sure that it has a very, very fast pace. So it really goes very, very fast questioning, as in most of the interviews in EPSO, actually. And the main topics of of the motivational interview, which, by the way, I'm a big fan of. I think it's important that they check the motivation of people. I think it's a crucial thing to check. So it's an exam that I'm welcoming personally. Is the origin of your interest to work in the EU? So they really have particular, like very personal questions, like why actually would you like to work for the EU? Then awareness and commitment to the European values. And for instance, what's very, I think what I liked a lot, for instance, last year they asked the people which value they relate to the most. So which one out of the 6 EU values would they choose as the most important for them, and why, of course. Which is a great question. Then understanding the present and future challenges of the EU. And here they would really ask you what are the, let's say, most important priorities, which of course we have a lot to speak about these days because there's a new commission in place, there are new priorities, or maybe some of those priorities which continue to exist. And what are the challenges, which of course, again, is something that I think there's a lot to discuss. There are quite some challenges these days.
Yeah, and just to step in here for a second, whether Esther is asking whether any critical point towards the EU is acceptable. Yes, as long as it's presented properly. So no one really thinks that everything is shiny, rosy, and perfect. So saying that the EU did not deliver on its original plans is a nice way of something, instead of saying, well, the EU completely failed on this project and it's a terrible outcome. So it's choosing the right words, be diplomatic. Certainly, this is not necessarily the place that even if your personal views are highly critical, to really voice them to the jury. You don't want to persuade them of your views at this point. This is a motivational interview where you want to show your knowledge and want to show your interest in working for the institutions for one reason or another.
And what I wanted to add is that they actually ask you of this. So one of the questions that candidates had last year is, what frustrates you about the EU?
What a good question.
It's a very nice question, because of course there are things that are frustrating. For instance, if I needed to pick one example that frustrates me, is that EU sometimes fails to communicate of its achievements, and that's frustrating because of course it gives rise to EU skepticism in many member states. And yeah, I guess there are many other things that we could say, that it is sometimes not easy, that things work slower and so on. And what I want to say about the knowledge, because that's of course one aspect that many people are getting, let's say,
have a different idea.
So what you should know, that the knowledge that they check.
I managed to disappear.
We deleted the knowledge.
Yeah.
But you should know that they ask basic things. So what they want to have is people who know the basics. So for instance, last year they asked about the Lisbon Treaty. But of course, it's the treaty that is in place. So it simply examines how much do you know how things work today. They also asked about the decision, but of course, you can give a very brief overview of the decision-making methods of the institutions. That's again something that was asked last year. Of course, you don't need to go deep. You in 1 or 2 minutes, you can't describe it in length, but you just probably can describe things about what are still decided by unanimity and what is by co-decision. So it's really, they don't go very deep. So what you should know, that you don't need to suddenly revise things, but what they want to see, I mean, not huge books, but what they want to see is that you are in the loop. You are not somebody who doesn't know how things work. Even if you are an outsider, that you follow EU hot topics, you follow, you read the news.
Maybe sign up for Politico's daily newsletter, the playbook, and read it for a couple of weeks before the exam. Largely, that should be sufficient. That's one. The second one is, we have on the website on EU Training a couple of e-learning courses which are free. with the caveat that they are a little outdated. So we haven't updated them for quite a few years. So it's there. It's a good resource. It explains each of the EU institutions, a little bit about the Lisbon Treaty. There are a couple of others. So that should be helpful to have a basic understanding of these concepts. But again, with the disclaimer that they haven't been updated. Well, unfortunately, history has kind of favored us because we talk about 27 countries, because it was before the Croatian enlargement, I believe. And now again, it's 27, though the numbers are different. So cynicism apart,
the countries are different.
yeah, the countries are different. But in any case, it's one of the resources that you could use.
And Giovanni is asking where we can find the information, the European values. I think you always refer to this nice fact sheets, short fact sheets of the European Parliament.
Yes.
So that's something very nice. It's really one page overview of different policies of, for instance, I'm sure you find something on the Lisbon Treaty or on decision-making mechanism. So you really have a quick overview of things there, so you can search for things. Of course, what I'm expecting that if, for instance, they asked for the Lisbon Treaty, probably they wouldn't ask this year. But especially what I would devote time is more thinking over your own motivation, what kind of position you are looking for. Maybe if you need to talk about challenges, how you, through your own lenses, show different challenges. Because if you say, yeah, Brexit is a challenge, probably every other candidate will say that. So I'm not saying that it's something that you shouldn't mention, but maybe if you have a specialist background in something or some kind of work experience already, you can think of other aspects that you see as a challenge at the European level, which are not so over-talked, I would say. So maybe it's good to go also to pick those things that are very, very common to say, like climate change. But then you can also think of other ideas as well, which you might have.
And Anna, here are one or two questions which I find relevant. So one technical question.
Yes.
Are the interviewers the same as the competency-based interview, or motivational interviewers are different?
No, it's different. So you are always evaluated once by the same person. So if you had somebody in your competency-based interview, you will not have him or her in any other test of the day. So it's a different panel. You will have a break between the two, and you will be evaluated by different two panel members. The setting is the same, so it's two people. But that's about it. So the rest is different.
Next question. To what extent can they ask about specific EU policies? So how much in-depth knowledge do you need, including data and statistics?
I wouldn't think that they would go that deep. It's a 20-minute interview, and they want to check all these 5 aspects that we had in the earlier slides. So they won't have time to go that deep. So the topics are here, and these really have been confirmed last year by the last year's questions.
So pretty macro level.
Yeah.
One more. How can we prepare about the knowledge of the EU, and how much thoroughly? I think we answered it partly with these resources, and I see that Veronica and Lenka were kind enough to share that. Thank you very much. And then there's also these Parliament briefings that I mentioned. I don't have the link, but it should be fairly easy to find on the European.
Google it and you find it.
Yeah, you'll find it on European Parliament's website, and they are pretty well done. Well, with the caveat that these are all written by the European Parliament, so I think there is a slight bias towards the institution, but that's kind of understandable. But be mindful that EPSO is still linked mostly to the Commission, even if it's interinstitutional. So when you talk about these things, make sure that there's a fine balance in your presentation between Commission, Parliament, Council, and all the other bodies and institutions of the EU.
And just to share with you as well, that on the 19th of March, we will have a live webinar on the motivational interview. So this is something that we would be very glad if you joined us, of course. So we will share more on the motivational interview on that day.
Yeah. Okay, here's another question. For the motivations, do you have to use the same as the one included in the talent screener? So what is the relationship between the talent screener and the motivational interview, if any?
Well, usually or you have a motivational interview, or you have a talent screener. So usually the talent screener is only used in specialist competition, and in specialist competitions there's no motivational interview. But in case if maybe you mean the simple let's say form that you filled in, and there are some motivational questions. So what you should know that usually those are read only when you are in the recruitment phase. So whatever you filled in your application form and you answer some motivational questions there at the beginning of the form, that would not be evaluated now, or wouldn't be really read now at the assessment phase, but more when you make it to the reserve list, and different services want to contact you for an interview, they might read that part to know a bit more of your background and of your let's say aspirations.
And here's one question. It's a very nuanced yet important one. Do we shake hands when we enter the room?
Well,
you give a high five. Hey, what's up? Probably not that. Probably not that. Don't take my words.
You can consider one of the two options. What I would say is that I would pay attention. What do they do? So of course one of them will open the door for you. So it might be easier to shake hands with that person. But sometimes the panels prefer to keep a distance. So I would have a bit of a minute of reflection. How do they
not
react?
A minute, perhaps a second,
not
right?
A second, a nanosecond nanosecond of seeing how they are. I don't think it's a crucial question, so this will not change anything, but what you should know that out of the two, one of them will sit at the table, which is a kind of more further away from you, and one will open the door. So you can shake probably hand with the one who is opening the door, and the other one will be further away. Of course you can go there and shake the hand, but honestly, yeah, I would leave it up to you, whatever you feel better about. What
about the dress code?
So what I would do is, of course, giving some respect, but also bear in mind that it's a full day, so you need to feel comfortable in whatever you are wearing. So if you are used to wearing tie and suit as a man, for instance, of course give the respect and dress up, but it's a long day, and I mean what you should also manage is your energy levels, as I said. So it's important that you feel comfortable in whatever you wear. So I would rather leave the tie if you hate it, and wear a shirt, and leave the jacket also in the box or the drawer. So it's fine to leave it there if you feel like it's really uncomfortable, or maybe it's hot. Yeah,
I tend to agree with that. So just being elegant is rather the way to go. Whatever that means for you personally, that's okay. So I wouldn't bother too much about that.
Yes, I also think so. Especially there are some IT people these days preparing. So if you never dress up and your way is informal, so just do a bit of respect, but you don't need to overdo it.
Yeah. So let's look at a couple of tips and tricks, Anna. What are your views on best ways of approaching the motivational interview?
So what I think is very important, so besides of the knowledge-based questions, which maybe freaks out most of you, maybe I wouldn't pay attention the most to those, but really to think over what is really your motivation. That's crucial to think over. And it's not enough to say like, I'm devoted to the European project, but actually think over like why this is something that is important for you. And what you should know that motivation is really a personal thing. Of course, you don't need to be overly going personal, but your motivation is probably different from my motivation or another candidate's motivation. So we are all differing in our ideas of why we actually want something. So think those over, and sometimes it's not always clear. So sometimes you need to talk about it actually to figure out, okay, why actually do I want that so much? And and give this personal aspect to it. So this is something where you need to show a little bit of yourself more than in the CBI, I would say. Then, prepare a narrative to it and, color it with real life events. So, yes.
You could say that, for instance, me very personally, actually, this is not a made-up example. When I was at university, I organized exchange programs, and some of these were financed from various European youth funds. So this was a very first encounter with what the EU does, that it helps these international exchange programs, and it's given a lot to me personally, to the participants, and many others. So I could build that into a nice narrative of how I got interested in European affairs, in international relations, and how that eventually landed me at the Court of Justice and the Commission, etc., etc. So I could build that into the motivation story and make it just more resonate or more impactful.
And as we say, you need to be up to date. So this is something very important. So I would emphasize to, as Andras said, read Politico. Maybe it's sometimes enough to read the headlines, but be more or less in the loop, because this is something important at this interview. And listen our webinar, as we say. Yes. So that's something we strongly advise.
There are lots of resources. So there are webinars, ebooks, tips and tricks, various articles. So make sure that you do your homework and your reading, so you'll be as up to date as possible. So with that, let's go to the next one, which is the group exercise. Anna, what is your message about the group exercise?
So first of all, just to share with you, this is an exercise that you wouldn't do individually, but you do it in a group, of course. It would be 6 people, but EPSO is doing already the exercise if there's only 4 of you on the day there. So this could happen. And what is very important, that with this 6 people, you need to work towards some kind of an outcome. So you get a scenario. You get an assignment, a bit similarly to the case study. So usually you are coming from a particular DG of the institutions. Maybe sometimes it's a non-real one. And usually you need to discuss a topic. And there are different options that are given in the scenario to you. And by the end of the exercise, so you have 15 minutes to prepare. You have some background documents. And by the end of you do a 15-minute preparation, and then you have a 40 or 50-minute exercise, depending on which competition you go for, to resolve this issue or to provide some kind of a solution. And as I said, there are usually 3 scenarios or 3 options that are provided to you in your assignment. Usually what it checks, so for instance, for the 85 competition now, it will check learning and development, working with others, and leadership. And in specialist competitions, the list could be longer, so there it could check up to 6 competencies. And for the 85, as I said, it's 40-minute exercise because it checks less competencies, so that's the basic reason. And the whole setting of the exercise is that you are sitting around the table and it's like a meeting, and you need to discuss between colleagues. And the assessors are sitting on the sides, so they are not
part of it.
Yeah, part of the exercise, and they have all the freedom to observe you, which I think is an excellent room to make all kinds of observations of what you do, what you don't do, what you do but you don't want to do. So to take note of whatever you express with your words, with your body, and so on. What's very important, that your last page is different. So that's something I think most of you might know. So you get this bunch of documents. It's something like 10-ish pages. And the last page is different for everybody. And what's very important, that this information you need to share with the others. Whatever is in your last page, it's there to be shared with the others. So this information needs to be shared. It could be something, for instance, from another EU institution, from industry, for instance. Sometimes it's from lobbyist group. Sometimes it's an information which is coming from trade union. So there are different matters, of course, what is under discussion. And the last page will always come from some kind of a different setting. And yeah.
Anything else to add on this?
What I'm thinking is that what you should know, and what is maybe a basic idea to share, is that you don't need to defend these points. So whatever is in the last page is, as I said, it needs to be shared with the rest of the group, but you don't need to defend those points. So it's not really a fist fight where you, whoever is stronger about the last page will get a point, but it's really an exercise of negotiation, of reaching a consensus, of exchange, and not really to strongly argue for one or another point.
Just to reinforce this point, it's a collaborative exercise. So you are there to work together and not 6 different people trying to work against each other and somebody trying to win. So it's much more synergetic and focused on a mutually beneficial outcome more than anything else.
So Juliana has a question on this. So should we disagree if we are not happy with what the others say? So in contrast with our note. So what you should know that you have all the freedom to go to a different conclusion. So it's something like, usually in the scenario or in the assignment, what it says that you are an EU official and you are discussing a question, for instance, on food labeling. This is an example that we often use in EU training with colleagues around the table. Maybe you have received an information from food industry. Of course, you are independent from the industry. So you are an EU official who is independent from that. Maybe you got this information because you went for a meeting. You will share this with your colleagues, but you don't have to defend it. You don't have to go for it. So you have all the freedom to go to a different direction. So if, for instance, the food industry thinks that for food labeling, you should use one kind of an option, and then you think differently, and the others convince you that you should think differently, you are free to go to another way.
Here's a question related to this. Are your colleagues, the ones you do the exercise with, and are you equal in the exercise?
Yes. So that actually usually the assignment is giving you very clear instructions on this, that there's no chair. So it's really, you are absolutely equal. There's no one person who would be a chairperson. You can all propose different ideas. You can all propose procedural ideas as well. So it would mean maybe sometimes you take the floor and you are the one, in a way, a bit taking some amount of leadership role. And maybe the next time it's somebody else. Maybe you will sum up things, and that's something that is very, let's say, useful for the whole group. Maybe others will propose to list pros and cons. So it's really that nobody is more leading than the other one.
And that's another question that just came up. What if there are too many leaders in the group, or wannabe leaders in the group?
So what you should know, that leadership is not dominance. So you shouldn't over-dominate the group discussion. It's really a lot about cooperation, and also, as you could see among the competencies, it's very much about working with others, which would be showing respect. If you start speaking at the same time, then you maybe pass the floor to the other one who started to speak, and you will score for working with others. So it's really not about dominating. If you end up having somebody who is very dominant, of course, it's not very lucky, because this is not very good if you have somebody like that. But try to gently, let's say,
point out
that this is not the goal of the exercise, so that it becomes clear that this is not what the exercise should be about.
Generally, in terms of good communication, start the sentence with I. And it shouldn't continue with saying, I believe you are too dominant in the exercise, but saying, well, I believe the goal of the exercise is that we collaborate more. And this tends to be less confrontational, yet effective in bringing back the attention to the actual task at hand.
What I would also say as well is that if somebody really talks too much and dominating the conversation, sometimes it's very good. First of all, try to intervene. Then if it doesn't work with the body language, so leaning forward, maybe raising a pen could work very well to interrupt the person. At the point, maybe just really take the floor and say like, it's very interesting what you say. However, I haven't heard the opinion of the other colleagues. So if you agree, I would pass the floor to the rest of the team. And then you really clearly show to the person, hello, this is not what we should be doing. And without actually pointing too strongly to the person. So that's what I would do.
Yeah, that's a good idea. And here's a question about how do you make sure that you continue to be engaged? So not to go into observer style.
Yeah.
I think it's very important that you try to be as aware throughout the exercise as possible, and that you participate at regular intervals. So it's not that you're active in the beginning, you feel you were too much, and then you just keep silent for 20 minutes, and then towards the end you jump in again. That's not the point. So being regularly in the discussion, and sometimes just asking a question is enough. So to say, Anna, what do you think about this? Or I'm not sure I fully understood your point. Can you summarize that? Or it seems, Anna, that you are in agreement and others are not necessarily of the same opinion.
Yeah.
So you can do these questions, observations, summaries. All of these would help you participate in the exercise well. Here's another question, Anna. Can leadership be demonstrated by content? So when you summarize ideas or show the bigger picture, share the goal, or is it more about setting the agenda, organizing a wrap-up, etc.?
So I would say leadership is definitely shown through proposing ideas of organizing the meeting. So, for instance, if you propose at the beginning to have a tour de table, roundtable discussion, that could be something that is taken for leadership. If you propose to list pros and cons for different options, that would be leadership. But what's very important, that don't focus only on leadership, because, for instance, learning and development, that's an interesting question. Okay, how to show learning and development? Of course, one of them Andras just said, so ask questions, because it means you want to learn, you want to develop your skills during the exercise. Another one is if you repeat something that you heard from another colleague around the table, that shows learning and development. So if a person is sharing something from his last page and 15 minutes later you refer to that is clearly demonstrating learning and development. Resilience is my favorite, in the sense that be aware of whatever you do under stress. Sometimes so what you should know, that it's the heaven of evaluators, the group exercise, because they don't need to do anything. They just sit on the side, they don't intervene, except if they tell you when the exercise starts, and when the exercise is over, they just observe. So they don't intervene at all. And of course, they can take notes of whatever. So if you play with your ring, if you play with your nails, if you move your legs, if you play with the pen, this will all show, to some extent, stress. And that will, of course, work against, let's say, your scores in resilience. So what you should know, that this is really, group exercise is really a key in body language. So have this awareness there.
Yeah. And just to maybe come back to 2 points. One is, there was a question earlier on, how do you know about timing in general? Is there a clock in the room also for the competency-based interview, group exercise, and the rest? Or do they tell you something?
Yeah, no. So there are clocks in the wall, on the wall. So in the group exercise, there's actually 2 of them usually. And for the CBI, yes, as well. You will see actually that the evaluators are also using it. So they often have their eyes on the clock. So yeah, this is something that you should have a strong awareness of. And for instance, in the group exercise, they usually tell you that it's 18:18. Now you can start the exercise. You will have 50 minutes. So you need to take a note of it, because they only say when it's over. So they don't remind like, yeah, you have 10 minutes. No, so they don't do that. You are responsible for time management.
And here's another one. Should you introduce yourself at the beginning? Why not?
It
I don't think
depends. So
it's
usually in
major,
the
but
assignment, they tell you are colleagues. So of course, if they tell you that you are from the same unit, in principle, you should know each other. What is a trick? There are several tricks you can use if you want to make sure that you know the names. One of them is that you introduce yourselves before entering the room. That I would do definitely. So those who are waiting there, of course, will be your counterparts. So why not to exchange names, introduce yourself, chit chat a little bit before entering.
And try to get a first impression of each person's style or how they communicate, how they interrelate.
Yeah, that's something to do. And then another thing, if you couldn't still remember all the names, you can also say as kind of the part of the game, like, "Hi, I see some new faces. Would you just shortly tell your name as well, or share your name?" Or you can also say, like, "I'm new to the unit. Would you say your name, please?" So simply going into the exercise and the assignment. So there are tricks to do it. Otherwise, I think it's okay also not to introduce and simply get the names beforehand.
Yeah, and then very important. So we do a lot of exercises, simulations for this particular exam. So in Brussels, there's also a webinar, but given the nature of this exercise, the best is to do it. And you can also do it now if you have a sort of a private group, right, Anna? So if you have a group of friends or colleagues who say, well, we want to come all together and have our professional coach evaluate your performance and give you a briefing, we can also cater to that. So we have our training center in Brussels, and you're more than welcome to make use of that.
And just in brackets, I think it's very advisable to practice with those people with whom you go on the same day. So of
if
course,
you know that, obviously,
yeah. But for instance, Facebook groups could be useful for that, to look for people who go on the same day and then practice together. That's something very useful.
Mm-hmm. Good. I know that there are a couple of questions still that we haven't covered. We'll try to come back to those in a briefing or some way or another. And I understand from the team that there was a little sound outage. Hopefully it is back. So Anna was just saying that you can even practice with the people who will be at the assessment center with you on the same day. And you can find out that information often through various Facebook groups or different informal channels. So you could do that. All right, we'll wait for a second, making sure that the sound is back.
I see that you are asking about name. So you will have a sticker on your clothes with the name, but the font that they are using usually is very small, so it's hard to read it. So I wouldn't advise to rely on that. Let's say, to read others' name, because it's not very easy to see those letters.
Okay. Yeah, we heard that there was a sound outage. Hopefully it's back and working as it should. And just to clarify, so informal channels, I meant Facebook groups or through different discussions you might have with other candidates, and you might know who is going to be with you on the same day for the group exercise. So let's look at the oral presentation briefly, because time is coming to the end for today's Q&A session.
So oral presentation is an exercise that is used for the 85 competition again. You will have a preparation of 15 plus 5 minutes. So it's a very short preparation, actually. You have some background documents, and you, on the basis of those background documents, you prepare your presentation, and the 5 minute is for the flip chart. And then you have to deliver the presentation in 10 minutes with the help of the flip chart that you prepared. And there's a question and answer phase with the evaluators asking you questions on what you covered. What you should know is that usually it's, as we say, 70% on how you actually deliver that presentation, how you do the flip chart, how you respond to the questions, and then on the content. Really, it's realistically, of course, you cannot really go very deep in the background documents in 20-minute preparation. It's very short. So this is pretty normal if you cannot go too deep. But what's very important, that you have to practice. how to do a proper, sufficiently good presentation in 10 minutes with such a short preparation time with background documentation. So this is something that is a question of practice again. Usually the competencies that are checked are analyzing and problem solving, communication, and resilience. So clearly some of those, I mean, basically analyzing and problem solving would be the one I think which is the most, let's say, content related, and the rest is more on how you deliver it more than on what you deliver.
And Christoph is asking, what background documents will you receive?
It could be a mix of different documents. Some of them are related and some of them are simply there to distract you. There could be also some charts, there could be emails, there could be press release, so all kinds of different style of the documents related to the same topic.
Mm-hmm. And just to come back on that, it's worth reading fast, that's for sure, and then perhaps highlighting certain pieces of information that you can include in your presentation. And if, for instance, if there is a large statistical chart, you might want to look at 2 or 3 lines, but not the entire chart. So you can say, well, this is the top performer, this is the worst performer, or something to that effect, because you have little time, but you still want to say something. You don't want to be very abstract in your presentation. So really focusing on quickly building a structure and then presenting bits and pieces of information along the lines of that structure.
I see a question from Esther. So resilience, does that mean that the assessors can ask horrible questions? So what you should expect is that they will ask you questions that you don't know the answer for. So they intentionally ask those questions. What can you do? There are several options, but basically there are 2 lines. One of them is that you can tell them that you don't really know exactly the figure, for instance, that they are asking for, but you can lead them through the way you think and give a rough estimation on the basis of some information that you know. In our oral presentation webinar, I think we used with Andras the example of Dutch bikes. So how many?
That's right, exactly. Yes.
How many bikes
are there in the Netherlands?
Are there in the Netherlands? Of course, you don't know the exact number. How would you know it? Maybe you didn't. Maybe it's in the background documents, but you didn't pick it. So instead of saying I don't know, what you could do is then give a rough estimation. Okay, yes, in the Netherlands there's something like 20 million people living.
15.
Then of course maybe the very youngest and the very oldest generation, maybe they don't have a bike. But okay, maybe there are people who have actually 2 bikes because they have in their weekend house a bike and they have in their home as well. So my rough estimation would be 20 million. But of course, I'm going to check this number for you and I'm going to come back to you. So basically, instead of saying I don't know, you can just give a rough estimation this way. And then, yeah, it's not that you don't say I don't know, but you also can say that some kind of an estimation which you base yourself on some amount of background information that you know.
You essentially walk them through your thinking.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. We just have from our team 22.5 million bicycles.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you.
That's very helpful.
So I didn't do a bad estimation at the end.
Good job, Anna. You passed. You passed with 10 points.
Thank you.
Should we use our knowledge or info from the materials?
Well, info from the materials.
Info from the materials is really the number one. And you could use some information as long as it doesn't contradict from what you know from the materials. And the 15 plus 5, you might want to mention that, Anna?
So the last 5 minutes is for preparing the flip chart. So you can't use PowerPoint, you can't use Prezi or any other source, but simply you do a flip chart with your hand.
Yes, so there's no PowerPoint. There are no computers, and it's in a simple room with the 2 assessors and then the flip chart. So that's how you write on it, and you can use it. And our general advice is really that you draw some structure on the flip chart, making sure that it helps your presentation and helps the assessors understand your understanding of the file. There is much more information and tips and tricks on this particular topic. So there's a dedicated webinar on the EPSO oral presentation, which we encourage you to check out. And there are also practice sessions, and Anna very often does personal private coaching as well. So I think with that, just to highlight a couple of other resources, because our time is coming to the end. So there are various Facebook pages which you might want to be part of. There are very vivid and lively discussions happening there on all sorts of competitions. So feel free to check those out. Then we have, as mentioned before, a lot of full day and half day sessions in Brussels that we run. And we also do webinars.
And what's very important that we run separate sessions for the specialist competitions and for the AD5 generalist. So make sure you apply for the right one, because the competencies, the exams are a bit different. So, but we will be very happy to see you there and to practice further on together.
Yeah, and if there is, perhaps if there's a larger community or an EU agency, then sometimes we offer trainings on the spot. But for other countries, this is not yet available, but you're always welcome to come to Brussels to these. And then there are the webinars, which make remote access possible. So with that, certainly the recording of today's session will be available along with the slides and all the other resources. And we'll try our best to answer all the unanswered questions that you put into the chat box in this hour and a half, and write up some memo or some other format in the next couple of days. Then there's certainly personal coaching. Anna herself does a lot, and Skype coaching as well if you are unable to use these services as well. And then there is the Ultimate EU Textbooks Assessment Center edition. The new edition is coming out in a couple of months, I would say, perhaps sooner, but I'd rather just say in a couple of months, with many updates and refreshments in it. And then last but not least, all your questions and answers are welcome through our contact form. It's through any sort of social media or any other way. So send those our way, and our colleagues will pass it on to myself, to Anna, to any other member of the team. We're very happy to assist you and help your preparation so you can succeed in the assessment center. So with that, I think we'll close off with those who were kind enough to stay all the way to the end. There is a special 20% off a promotion with the code EPSO 2020 AC, all caps. And that's a code that you can use for any online products that we have on the website, and it's only valid for 48 hours. So feel free to use it, tell your friends, and make the best out of your preparation. So with that, anything else to add, Anna?
Yes, good luck. We wish you all the best, and we hope we could be of good resource today and also in the future.
Well, thank you so much for your attention, and thank you very much to the team in Budapest, to Lenke and Veronica, for being so helpful in making today's webinar happen. And to be continued, keep us posted. Once you've passed and you're on the reserve list or you got a job, let us know. There's even a webinar on how to get a job once you are on the reserve list. Check that out. Make sure you maximize your chances of landing a job. So thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah, bye.